Red Bull's definitive improvement of its 2025 car is saving Max Verstappen's season, but it's come at the surprising price of a 2026 sacrifice. Verstappen couldn't make it 3 F1 victories in a row in Singapore, but he and Red Bull were George Russell's closest challenger all weekend, and he did beat McLaren in a straight fight at a high downforce circuit for the first time this year. Not only that, but it came at a track where he and Red Bull have had some real head-scratching problems in recent seasons. Even McLaren team boss Andrea Stella admitted this was evidence of Red Bull really getting on top of its car's main weaknesses, which is the result of sustained intense development around the floor and in Singapore the addition of a new front wing. It's been a big commitment as Red Bull looked lost before the summer break and Verstappen was speaking extremely forlornly about the rest of the season. And clearly, it's working. Finishing second to Russell in Singapore only made a small dent in Oscar Piastri's championship lead, but Verstappen and Red Bull know the title is a long shot anyway. It's a lot more important to get back to being in contention more often. And even though Red Bull wasn't quite on McLaren's level for race pace in Singapore, being genuinely faster in qualifying is what earned the track position that proved crucial. This hasn't happened before at maximum downforce circuits. Verstappen's early giant-killing feats against the McLarens this season, including winning at Suzuka back in April, have come from the 4-time world champion making a lower drag setup work on tracks with bigger aero compromises. And his recent back-to-back poles and wins at Monza and in Baku came at tracks where everyone was running low downforce. So this was a clear step, but it's come at a price. Team principal Laurent Mekies admits that pushing on for so long this year has to hurt Red Bull's preparations for F1's massive 2026 rule changes, which every other team, including McLaren, switched full focus to much earlier. That's a surprising risk to have taken, but it's not happened just to make Verstappen happier this year. Red Bull's long been in a development funk, and getting to the bottom of its problems at low downforce tracks last year and long-running weaknesses with curb riding has been key. Mekies has explained that Red Bull felt it was very important to do this because even though the 2026 cars are totally different, they are being developed with the same tools and methodologies. So Red Bull really needed to validate all its aspects of development and its understanding to be confident going into a crucial winter of 2026 work. That comes at a cost, as some of that work has had to be delayed, but Red Bull feels it's the right trade-off given the position it was in before. While Stella openly acknowledges that Red Bull passed a key test in Singapore, McLaren driver Lando Norris didn't seem happy at all to have his old rival being talked up so much. There was a slightly irritable air to Norris at times through the weekend, as he was annoyed with his own driving on Friday and Saturday, a bit fed up with questions about his run-in with teammate Piastri on Sunday, and in between had a run-in of sorts with Verstappen. This happened in qualifying when Verstappen felt Norris had needlessly dawdled ahead of him on his final run in Q3, and the two had a mild war of words after. But what made Norris a lot more prickly was a question he got about Red Bull's recent renaissance and Verstappen being so strong on a high downforce track. Even Stella was among those curious to see how Red Bull fared in Singapore and acknowledged that this track has brought Red Bull problems in recent seasons. Stella gave 2 reasons for why it was interesting for everyone to see how the weekend played out. First, to see if the Monza and Baku form could be replicated at high downforce and high drag, and second, to see if Red Bull had resolved its past problems on this track. Stella went on to say the fact Red Bull has proven it's got better in these areas is not a surprise because Red Bull is a top level team and Verstappen is leading its charge. But it's at least mildly amusing that Stella used very similar terminology around Red Bull that Norris clearly disagrees with, even if that's happened accidentally. In a post-qualifying media appearance, Norris took issue with the suggestion that Red Bull struggled in Singapore last year when Verstappen recovered from a tough Friday to qualify a 10th off pole, then finish a distant second to Norris in the race. Norris said that him being 4 tenths off pole this year must mean my car is 4 times worse than last year's Red Bull, and when it was then said this weekend was supposed to be the litmus test of Red Bull's recent development work, Norris replied, "I don't think that at all." Norris's underlying point is largely correct. Red Bull had already started to make progress before Singapore because of that big development push. And Red Bull has had moments where it's been as quick or quicker than McLaren through the year, even before the recent low drag track, so it's not like Verstappen's been driving a shed. But that's also kind of why Singapore was being talked about as a key test, to prove Red Bull could consistently hit the peaks that Verstappen has dragged out of the car at various points, even at tracks Red Bull's been vexed by in recent years. There's definitely been a trend this year of Norris getting annoyed at suggestions Verstappen is overachieving in his car and that Red Bull's had a bad season. His Singapore comments were a fresh pushback, which may well reflect how the competitive order has shifted and brought Verstappen back into play, and the fact that McLaren was simply not quite as competitive in Singapore as Norris would have wanted. He's playing catch up in the championship himself, and winning is the best way to take the most points out of Piastri. So Norris isn't just concerned with Verstappen becoming a nuisance again, it's directly hurting his title bid. Unlike in Azerbaijan, where a tricky McLaren was still fast enough to be in the mix had the two drivers done a better job, the MCL39 looked genuinely short of the pace required to match either Mercedes or Red Bull in Singapore qualifying. Norris said, "We're just not quick enough," and that Russell's pole lap was just out of our league, a feeling McLaren's rivals have had on many occasions this season. So a year after, Norris edged Verstappen to pole by only a tenth, then went on to blitz the race. A combination of resurfaced parts of the Singapore track, car trays and tyre construction meant McLaren had its worst qualifying of 2025 in terms of performance. Its previous biggest deficit to pole came in Canada, and that's not a coincidence. Stella says there's now been a pattern across the Azerbaijan and Singapore weekends that resembles the Montreal race back in June, where Russell and Verstappen were the two top drivers and McLaren was third best. The core similarity between the tracks is that they have a lot of short corners and bumpy braking zones. Stella says McLaren is suffering a bit when the emphasis is on short corners that don't give its car the chance to make up time that it seems to be losing under braking and on traction. But there are other variables too. Norris actually compared it to Las Vegas last year, where Russell won for Mercedes in dominant fashion, which was different as it came in much cooler conditions and McLaren couldn't switch its tyres on as well as others. But the problem was similar, a weak front end and understeer, which is Norris's self-confessed worst nightmare. Norris thinks that in Singapore, this was because McLaren couldn't get enough grip at the front to compensate for how much rear grip was being produced on resurfaced parts of the track. He also suggested the 2025 McLaren, which has a different front suspension design that's given Norris more grief than Piastri, especially earlier in the year, is more susceptible to the problem because it dulls the front end slightly. Meanwhile, Stella suggested another factor, which is that the construction of Pirelli's 2025 front tyres have exacerbated that dulled feeling. This might sound like a lot of different excuses being flung at the wall, but it could also just point to a perfect storm that meant Singapore just wasn't McLaren's weekend. With McLaren beaten again, Verstappen may smell blood, if not in the championship, then certainly the 6 remaining races. While we need to wait until next March to see how much Red Bull has suffered for delaying full focus on its 2026 car, the ultimate short-term payoff for Red Bull would be that Verstappen starts to make bigger inroads on his 63-point deficit to Piastri and steals the driver's title. Realistically, the gaps haven't changed enough for Verstappen to be confident that's possible, but he at least has a better chance now of beating the McLarens more often. There's no question that Red Bull and Verstappen are on their best run of the year, and the best part of that is obviously that it hasn't been down to circumstances, it's been that the cars worked well at different types of tracks. But even though Verstappen's on a 3-race McLaren beating run, there's still a degree of uncertainty about how sustainable it is. As we've established, there are reasons for why McLaren didn't thrive in Singapore as it did 12 months ago, at least over one lap, and in terms of the comfort levels of the two drivers. In terms of race pace though, the McLaren still was the fastest car, so it's not like it's suddenly gone off the boil. The simplest explanation is that the respective development trends mean that the gaps are closer again and McLaren's weaker moments are more exposed now than at other points of the season. This could open the door more, but it's still no guarantee that Red Bull keeps finishing ahead. Remember, it wasn't that long ago that McLaren's rivals were interfering on Saturdays then getting blown away on Sundays. The final quarter of the season will be extremely revealing. Red Bull reckons Austin will play to the famous mid-speed corners that McLaren is so strong, while McLaren believes its short corners and big braking areas could play to Red Bull's strengths. Mexico and Las Vegas are tougher to read, but McLaren is surely going to flex its muscles again in Brazil, Qatar and Abu Dhabi. And realistically, Verstappen and Red Bull need to be closer on McLaren's best days to truly feel vindicated in sacrificing next year the way Red Bull has.